On the evening of September 1st, 1974, a grandmother pushed through the tall pines along Carberry Creek in southern Oregon, expecting to find her daughter and grandchildren packing up their campsite. Instead, she stumbled into a scene that would haunt investigators for decades. A camp stove sat neatly assembled, a dishpan filled with water, still resting by the picnic table. Belinda Cowden's purse and keys lay untouched. Richard Cowden's expensive wristwatch and wallet, with cash inside, had been abandoned. A half-full carton of milk, the one he bought that very morning at the Copper General Store with his 5-year-old son, sat sweating in the late summer heat. But the Cowden family themselves, Richard, Belinda, 5-year-old David, and 5-month-old Melissa, were nowhere to be found. No signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away. Just a campsite frozen in time, as if the family had stepped out for a moment and simply never returned. When deputies arrived, their unease deepened. Nothing had been taken. Nothing suggested robbery, and there were no answers hidden in the silence of the surrounding forest. The Cowden campsite looked more like a stage left mid-act. Food, belongings, and life itself waiting for players who would never come back. The Siskiyou Mountains had claimed 4 lives, but no one yet knew how. What began as an abandoned campsite quickly spiraled into one of Oregon's most chilling mysteries, a disappearance that would spark one of the largest searches in state history and culminate in a discovery so disturbing it would scar the region's memory forever. When a word spread that a family had not returned, the valley's volunteers gathered like organized weather. Friends, relatives, deputies, the Forest Service, and neighbors spread themselves over the ridges and the creek bottoms, searching the well-traveled loops and the empty hollows alike. This was one of Oregon's largest search efforts to date. People walked along game trails, called into caves, and examined the quiet geometry of the forest for signs that might explain where 4 people had gone. Search parties found the ordinary things family life leaves behind: a diaper bag, the half-full milk carton now warm from the day, cigarette packs, the camp stove assembled and unused. What they did not find were footprints that continued into the trees or the flattened path of hurried passage. In the days that followed, with each sweep of legs and boots, the search widened. Radios called in sightings and dead ends. A miner, later interviewed, would say he walked a certain cave that very weekend and found nothing. His later identification of the same cave widened questions. If the bodies were not there then, when did they come to rest there? Who had the knowledge to move them? Time in the forest becomes its own kind of record. Seasons, the slow feathering of moss on a rock, the stack of needles along a log. Weeks turned to months. The official investigations collected witness statements. A family who had seen a truck parked nearby acting like they were waiting for us to leave, and the list of persons of interest began to form. The volunteer officers and deputies cross-checked names, addresses, and criminal histories. For the Cowden's family, a community's memory rippled between sorrow and the need to find a hold. A watch on a picnic table, a child's toy lost in the grass, a woman's purse left between the coffee and the ketchup. The valley kept searching. The searching people brought flashlights, ropes, and the stubborn conviction of neighbors who know each other's rhythms. They did not yet know that their effort would find not the missing on some weathered path, but a secret hidden carefully in the slope and shadow of the hills 7 miles away. 7 months later, in April, the west had thawed from winter into a soft, deceptive spring. 2 men walking the old paths of respect found what their boots had not been intended to find. Human remains on a steep hillside, and in a small cave nearby, more bodies. The first discovery remained imprinted on every account. An adult male tied to a tree high on the slope, like an attempt at concealment, except that the sun has a way of revealing secrets in its own time. In the cave below, the others lay where they could not be concealed forever. An adult female, a child, and an infant. Dental records and careful forensic ID confirmed that they were indeed the Cowden family. The distance from the campsite, roughly 7 miles, shocked investigators and the community. How did the family travel from the ordered small world of their campsite to this remote hiding place? Were they killed and moved? Or did the killers carry them, one by one, to the cave and hillside with the knowledge of a local's map of blind places? Forensics on remains of that era were limited in comparison with later tools. Yet the autopsy outcomes were blunt and grim. Belinda and the 5-year-old had suffered .22 caliber gunshot wounds. The infant's death was due to severe head trauma. Richard's cause of death could not be definitively determined from the state of his remains and location. No gun, no murder weapon, no simple trail. Only the forest's cold envelope and the questions that seemed to grow like lichen on stone. The discovery altered the landscape of grief. The friends who had searched, the neighbors who had refused to give up, and the officers who had worked the case turned their attention to piecing together a map from fragments. The valley adjusted to the knowledge that these neighbors had been taken far beyond the campsite where they were last seen. For a community, that sense of distance became a kind of final insult, as if the forest itself had been complicit in burying them both physically and in rumor. No case is ever without people who become names in reports. Investigators looked to those who had been in the area, to the small cabins and guest books of miners and loggers, to trucks that had been seen by other campers that weekend. Among the names that entered the official files was Dwayne E. Lee Little, a man with violent criminal history who had been in the region that Labor Day weekend. Little's past, a juvenile murder, later criminal acts, and his presence in the area made him a compelling figure to investigators. Little's parole status, his later violent convictions, and witness statements put him in a circle of suspicion. The girlfriend's testimony that she saw him in possession of a .22 caliber firearm months after the Cowden's disappearance tightened circumstantial threads, while an inmate later claimed that Lil had confessed in a cell. Yet the law, properly bound to the standard proof, never altered its posture into indictment. Lil was not charged in the Cowden killings. Circumstance, rumor, and subsequent violent convictions made him a suspect in the public imagination and in investigators' notebooks. But the case did not close. Police continued to follow leads. A miner's guest book that recorded a stopover by Little and his parents, the matching pickup truck description reported by a family who had felt watched, and the geometry of the cave itself, which only someone familiar with the local topography would likely have known. The case, as much as anything, became an exercise in what could be proven in court versus what seemed likely to those who knew both the man and the land. For the Cowden's relatives, suspicion was not justice. It was a list of names, a mounting anger. For investigators, it was the narrow corridor between evidence and accusation. For the forest, the name mattered little. The ridgelines kept their silence. When the facts were collected and the autopsy conclusions placed on record, the valley still carried an ache that simple lists could not name. Friends and family arranged memorials. Strangers wrote about the case in small-town publications, and, years later, true crime writers and local journalists returned to the story to try to understand its contours. The Cowden murder became, in reporting and retelling, a haunting emblem of the ways in which a quiet family can be swept away and incommensurably lost. Locally, the story altered the practical rhythms of camping and neighborliness. People in the area learned anew how few certainties there are when remote roads and indifferent hills make detective work as much about who knows what's secret as about physical evidence. The memory of a child's laughter that once belonged to a creekside afternoon now read as an absence. The watch left on the picnic table and a half-finished carton of milk became small, inexorable testimonies of ordinary life interrupted. Over the years, the case drew the attention of writers, documentary makers, and online chroniclers. And Rule included a chapter about the Cowdens in her investigative work, and local TV scores later produced retrospectives that sifted through the public records and interviews. Online forums and investigators revisited the files, argued over interpretations, and assembled timelines. Yet in these decades of attention, definitive closure remained stubbornly out of reach. For all the reportage and the circles of conjecture, the central fact remained. For people had vanished from their campsite and were later found murdered. For the family and the small community that remembered them, the case did not become a story that could be read and set down. It became a quiet testament to the cost of injustice and a lingering need to remember. Grief insists on details. The Cowden story calls to them: the watch on the table, the diaper bag folded open, the cup unfinished. And those details demand more than curiosity. They demand that we honor what cannot be unwound. In that spirit, the final chapter is offered not as speculation but as remembrance. Remember Richard, a man who woke with the sun and who drove logs and trucks, a man whose ordinary kindnesses are recorded in the small things of a camp, buying milk for his family, walking with his son to the general store. Remember Belinda, A young mother whose careful placement of her purse and the camp stove underlines the small, practical acts of love that sustain a child-rearing household on a weekend away. Remember David and baby Melissa, the boy and the infant whose lives were, briefly, the bright axis of family's weekend memory. This tribute honors the factual contours of what happened, the dates, the discoveries, the autopsy results, the suspect who was never charged, and focuses him toward an act of remembrance. It refuses the sensationalization that can flatten pain into a narrative device, and instead offers a quiet record of human life interrupted. A family that went camping, a neighbor who brought grief back to the roadside, prospectors who found what the month had hidden, investigators who followed the threads as far as evidence allowed. If there's a lesson, it is this: that remote beauty can be dangerous not because of place but because of people, that the forest holds secrets long after human memory is frayed, and that the act of naming, of saying Richard, Belinda, David, Melissa, keeps their presence in the world, however small, however dear. To tell their story factually is, in itself, a kind of guard against oblivion. Here are stories that history tries to forget, and then there are those it cannot. The disappearance and murder of the Cowden family in 1974 is one of those tragedies that refuses to fade, not because of sensationalism, but because of the terrible simplicity of it. A young father, a young mother, a bright little boy, and an infant girl, a family defined not by notoriety, but by ordinariness, went out for a weekend camping trip in the mountains of Oregon. They did what countless other families did that summer, what countless others still do: packed food, pitched a tent, and tried to claim a few quiet hours of peace in the outdoors. And they never came home. What lingers is not just the brutality of their deaths, but the stark emptiness of their absence. For months, the Siskiyou wilderness swallowed every trace of them. Their campsite remained suspended in time. Food on the table, belongings neatly arranged, a fishing pole resting against a tree. It looked less like a crime scene than a still life of interruption. It was as though the family had been plucked from existence, leaving behind the echo of a life halted mid-breath. When their bodies were finally discovered months later, hidden away in the Oregon woods, the mystery ended, but the heartbreak deepened. Nothing about the discovery answered why. Nothing restored what had been stolen. And perhaps that is the cruelest part. The way murder writes a full stop where there should have been decades of commas and paragraphs. School recitals, anniversaries, birthdays, and all the simple daily ordinaries that stitch a family together. To speak of them now is not only to recount a crime, but to resist erasure. Because the Cowden family were not just names in a headline, or ages listed in a coroner's report. They were people whose lives held texture and light. Richard was a young man of 28, steady and hard-working, someone who carried both the quiet strength of responsibility and the natural restlessness of youth. Belinda, at 22, was still nearly at the beginning of her adult life, yet already bore the tenderness of motherhood, her hands full with a 5-year-old and an infant, but her heart even fuller. David, only 5, was all possibility, that boundless, glowing stage of boyhood where curiosity is still larger than fear. And Melissa, the baby, just 5 months old, knew nothing but the warmth of being held. What was taken from them was more than breath. It was time they might have had together. Time for David to grow into the person he was meant to be. Time for Melissa to speak her first words. Time for Richard and Belinda to see gray in each other's hair, and to learn the beauty of long years lived side by side. Murder does not only destroy the present, it ransoms the future. Yet even in tragedy, there remains a form of survival. The Cowden family lives on not in the mechanics of the crime, but in the way people continue to remember them. Theirs is a story that still draws a hush when retold, that still echoes in the voices of those who knew them, that still surfaces in the minds of strangers decades later who find themselves haunted by the image of a picnic table set with food that would never be eaten. Memory has a way of resisting violence. To speak their names is to say that what happened to them matters, that the world cannot be permitted to simply close over their absence as though it were a natural thing. There are places in Oregon where the silence feels heavier than elsewhere, where the forests seem to carry a knowledge too deep for words. Carberry Creek is one of those places. To walk there now is to feel that absence pressed into the soil, into the riverbank, into the sighing of the trees. But perhaps, if one is quiet enough, there is also something else, Not the horror of the crime, but the fragile dignity of the family who was lost. The memory of Richard teaching his son how to fish. Belinda laughing at the baby's tiny sounds. A weekend that should have ended with nothing more dramatic than packing up the car and driving home. This is not just a true crime story. It is a human story. And like all human stories, it demands empathy more than analysis. The details of the investigation matter. Yes, the suspects, the timelines, the theories. But those are not what endure in the heart. What endures is a family. A father, a mother, a boy, and a baby girl who once sat together under the trees of Oregon, ordinary and beautiful, unaware that the world they trusted could turn so suddenly against them. When we remember them, we resist reducing them to victims. They were a family with dreams, with love, with laughter. And though their lives were cut short, their story endures as a solemn reminder how fragile life is, and how deeply cruelty can wound the fabric of community. Their loss still whispers through the decades, not in screams, but in the quiet ache of what should have been. Perhaps the most haunting thing about the Cowden family's tragedy is how recognizable they were. They could have been any family. Their story is not one of reckless risk or dangerous adventure. It is a story of everyday people stepping into the woods for a holiday weekend. In that ordinariness lies the resonance. We see ourselves in them. We see our own families in them. And it is that mirror that makes the loss almost unbearable to contemplate. The Siskiyou Mountains still stand. The trees still grow tall. The river still runs cold. The world moves on, indifferent to human grief. But memory has power that stone and water do not. The Cowden family is remembered, not because of the violence that ended their lives, but because of the love and humanity that defined them before it. In telling their story, we keep them alive in the only way we can. May their names be spoken not with fear, but with reverence. May their brief lives remind us that even the smallest joys, a boy's laughter, a baby's smile, a family's embrace, are the things that matter most. And may the silence of Carberry Creek never fully swallow their voices, but instead carry them forward, faint but enduring, into every generation that pauses long enough to listen. Red heart in memory of a family who deserved far more than the world gave them.